Hello, welcome to ECO-595, Applied Business Research. In this lecture, we're going to go over Chapter 3, Theory Building. Now, whenever we mention theory, people used to think, oh, that's something very dry, very abstract, and that's something that is not quite practical, okay? The goal of this chapter is to allow you to better appreciate theory and to let you know that theory actually can help a lot in business research. Let's start with an example. Suppose right now you flip the switch, but the light didn't come on. What would you do? Now, apparently, if you are experienced about this, you're going to search in your mind for certain theories, we call them theories, to determine what could be the potential cause of this failure, right? And then you're going to check everything to test the potential reasons to determine which is the real cause. It could be that the bulb burned out. It could be that the electricity was cut off due to various reasons. And once you find the real cause, you're going to search in your mind again for solution. Although you probably wouldn't recognize that you have this process of searching theory, at least in your mind, once you determine, oh, it's the light bulb that burned out, you're going to say, oh, I'm going to get a new one, put it in, it should work, right? That is still a process where you search for theory, apply the theory, okay? So we call this kind of theory attribution theory, and apparently when you search theory, what I meant is actually that's based on your experience. Experience tells us this could happen. And actually, if you think about theory, theory is the summarization of what we observe in reality. It's just a higher level of the reality. Okay? So what is a theory? Well, a theory is a formal logical explanation of some events that includes predictions or how things relate to one another. Basically, theory is just a generalization of facts and experience, right? Just like when the light didn't come up, based on experience, that's theory, you determine the cause and you determine the solution, right? Now, there's one fundamental theory in business, which is called theory of supply and demand. And hopefully you've learned this in your econ course before. If not, that's fine, because this theory is easy to understand, it's fundamental. Basically, it tells us that the price of product is determined by the supply and demand at the same time. When price goes up, quantity demanded usually goes down, and quantity supplied usually goes up, okay? So that's the theory of supply and demand. Why this theory is helpful? Well, because it tells us that, look, although when we usually think the price of something is determined from the supply side because the supplier will determine the price based on the cost, that's usually, not usually, sorry, that could be some of the opinions certain people hold. However, the theory tells us, look, supply and demand both together determine the price. That is, we consumers as a group will affect the price of a product. Okay, so that's one theory. Here's another example. Actually, researchers have developed theories about the link and structure of social networks. Okay, and in such theories, they try to kind of summarize the linkage, how linkage are formed, and they found several aspects. It could be family relationship, could be friendship, professional association, etc. So all such, I guess, interactions could form linkage, and then that could be part of the social network. Now, in addition, in recent years, we have electronic social networking, such as Facebook and Twitter, right? So apparently that brings another way of building linkage and social networking with others. Now, why do we need theory? The goals of theory. There are two goals of theory. The first one is to help us understand the environment. And by understanding the environment, it enables us to better deal with or cope with certain situations. For example, financial crisis. The latest one is from 2007 to 2009, right? And of course, economists will sit down and study what could have caused such financial crisis. And why this is important? Because by learning what happened during that period and by figuring out the cause of such financial crisis, we could learn our lesson and we could better deal with such situations, and we could design policies to try to avoid such situations. Okay, and this is why after the financial crisis, we see a lot of regulation in regards to housing mortgage, right? So that's the first goal. Now the second goal is to predict behavior. Theory can help us to make predictions. For example, it is usually believed that gender and age could affect people's tolerance on risk. So why this is important? Because for example, for financial advisors, okay, based on the theory, they know different customers will have different tolerance on risk. And according to the theory, they will be able to predict the tolerance on risk based on the consumer's profile, whether it's a female, male, whether it's a young, middle-aged, or senior people. Then they will kind of be able to predict the tolerance on risk and then suggest the right product for each customer. Okay. Now, next, let's talk about how theory was built and how theory is related to hypothesis. Recall that hypothesis is the main component of a business research. It is also the main component of the scientific method we talked about last time. Okay, so research concepts. Now, concept is a generalized idea about the class of objects, attributes, occurrences, or process that has been given a name. Well, that sounds complicated. Actually, it's not that complicated. Basically, a concept may just be a term in different courses you are taking. For example, if we're talking about organizational theory, right? We talk about leadership, we talk about productivity, we talk about morals, right? These are concepts. Although when you learn them, they are called terms, or it could be vocabularies to you, but they are concepts. They are a generalized idea about a class of objects, okay? We generalize as leadership. It could be the leadership in Coca-Cola. It could be the leadership in Texas A&M Commerce, okay? But that's specified, so we generalize that as leadership. And if we're talking about the theory of finance, we could be talking about gross domestic product. Of course, that term is more related to economics, by the way. We could be talking about asset. We could be talking about risk aversion, etc. If we talk about accounting, it could be liabilities, depreciation, etc. So that's concept. And why we mention concept here? Well, because concept is the building block of proposition, and proposition is what we call theory. Okay? So, for example, a theory could say, or a proposition could say that older workers prefer different rewards than younger workers. And when I say this is proposition, that basically means this statement is already proved true. Okay? Now, in this proposition, we see two pieces of concepts. Okay. One is the age of worker, because we say older worker tend have different preference than younger people. So that's the age of worker. And the other one is reward preference, because we say they prefer different rewards. So that's the other concept. And these two concepts are building blocks of the proposition or the statement I just mentioned. Okay? Now, what about hypothesis? Oh, well, before that, let me mention this as well, because that will be our example throughout a few slides. Another example of the proposition is treating employees better will make them more loyal employees. And in general, we believe that's the truth. So back to proposition, they are the statements explaining the logical linkage among certain concepts by asserting a universal connection between concepts. And such propositions have already been proved to be true. Okay, so that's propositions. They are proved to be true. Okay, and they are statements about concepts, and also they are part of a theory. Okay, when we talk about theory, the theory can be bigger than propositions, and several propositions all combined together can be a theory. So basically, the lowest level will be concept, next level is propositions, the next level is theory. Okay. Well, how can we prove a proposition is true? Through testing hypotheses. That's how hypothesis is related to propositions. So what is a hypothesis? It's a formal statement of an unproven proposition that is empirically testable. All right, this is a very important sentence because it tells us several aspects about hypothesis. It must be a formal statement. It cannot be a question, okay? It must be a formal statement. It is an unproven proposition, which means the hypothesis could be supported or could not be supported. It depends on our test. We're going to test the hypothesis using data to determine whether the statement is true or not. That's what we call hypothesis testing. Okay, so hypothesis needs to be tested to determine whether the statement is true or not. And the other thing, the other key idea here is hypothesis must be empirically testable. All right, that is the key for you when thinking about your research hypothesis. When you write your research prospectus, okay, research hypothesis is one of the main components. And I will pay a lot of attention to your research hypothesis because that tells me how much thought you have been given to the research prospectus, and also that tells me whether the research you propose will be effective or not. So pay attention to the hypothesis you're going to propose. As of right now, the fundamental requirement is it must be a formal statement, not a question. It is an unproven proposition that needs to be tested using data. In addition, it must be empirically testable. What do I mean by empirically testable? That means for this statement, I could go out, collect data about the concept, and utilize statistical tools to analyze data. Of course, that part is unknown right now because we haven't talked about the skills or the tools to test hypotheses. And then after analyzing the data, I will be able to tell whether this formal statement is supported by the data or the formal statement is not supported by the data. Now, if we find the statement to be supported by the data, that could be proposition we were talking about. Okay, and proposition is part of a theory. Okay, so if suppose this example, this proposition was not proved yet, how can we test it? So corresponding hypothesis could be increasing retirement benefits will reduce intention to leave the organization. Okay, now think about it. For this proposition, the two concepts are treating employees or how employees are treated. That's one concept. And the other concept is loyal employees. Okay, so that's the other concept. Now, in order to test such propositions, we need to, I guess, rephrase it so that we can collect data and test it. When we say treating employees better, there could be several things. And now you need to specify exactly how you plan to treat your employees better. And for this case, we are thinking about increasing retirement benefits. Okay, that's one way to treat your employees better. The other concept, more loyal employees. Loyal employees. What do you mean by loyal employees? So for the hypothesis, we must change the wording to intentional to leave the organization, which is basically the potential turnover rate, right? Intentionally to leave the organization is the intention to quit. So this is the corresponding hypothesis that could be tested by collecting data. Now, if I want to find out whether such statement is supported or not, I could collect data on benefits, retirement benefits. I could collect data on each employee's intention to leave. And then after analyzing such data, I will be able to determine whether this statement is true or not. Okay? So what I was talking about just now involves several things. The first one is empirical testing. As I mentioned, that means we could collect data to measure the concept, analyze the data to determine whether the statement is supported or not. So that's what we call empirical testing. We're testing the hypothesis to see whether it's true or not. Okay? Now, when we test the hypothesis, we actually look at two variables, and such variables are the measurement of the concept. Think about the proposition right back here. I was mentioning two concepts. First one is employee treatment, and the second one is loyal employees, right? That's the two concepts. In the paradigm, when we test the hypothesis, we are looking at two variables. The first one is retirement benefits, because that's the aspect we determine by saying treating the employees better, okay? And when we say employee treatment, we're referring to retirement benefits for this specific hypothesis. And the second variable is the intention to leave, which kind of measure employee loyalty. Okay, so these are the two variables involved in the empirical testing. And finally, you set up the hypothesis. Now you say, okay, I'm ready to test my hypothesis. I'm going to go out and collect data. But wait a minute. What data are you going to collect? That depends on how you operationalize the hypothesis. Okay? And when we say operationalizing the hypothesis, we mean we want to identify the actual measurement to assess the variable input. Okay? We're going to talk about this more in chapter 13, but right now, I want to mention it briefly. We identify the actual measurement to assess the variable means for retirement benefits, okay, we said we're going to increase retirement benefits, but by how much? So we need to make it operationalized, which means we could specify that we increase retirement benefits by 5%. Okay? This is something that's measurable. We could go out, look at the prior retirement benefits, add 5% to it. That's the proposed change. Okay? And then for intention to leave, how do we measure intention to leave? Well, that's actually, if you think about it, the intention to leave is something that's very abstract. It's based on every person's perception, and it is something you don't observe directly. So you have to make it directly measurable, and one solution is turnover rate. That is a measure of intention to leave, although it's not a direct measure. It is something measured that we can collect data. And therefore, when we move from quit employee better and more loyal employee to increase retirement benefit to 5% and reduce annual turnover, we are operationalizing our hypothesis. Okay. Now, finally, I want to talk about two theories. Another theory about the voluntary job turnover. Basically, why people quit. Okay. So according to the theory, right, we have two major factors that affect an employee's decision to quit. One is the perceived ease of movement. All right. For example, it could be expectation of finding alternatives or other opportunities. The other factor is perceived desirability of movement, whether you are satisfied with the current job or not. That also determines whether you will quit or not, right? So according to this theory, these are the two major factors that will affect the intention to quit. And if you look at the relationship between these two factors and the intention to quit, we call that proposition, because according to the theory, it says that perceived ease of movement and perceived desirability of movement will affect a person's intention to quit. Now, a person's intention to quit apparently will affect voluntary job turnover. Not all intention to quit will turn into voluntary turnover, but the higher the intention, the more likely this person will quit, right? So that's another proposition, and it's also part of the theory. Now, the theory can be more complicated than what you see here, because if you think about perceived ease of movement, that also depends on more factors at the macro level. It could be labor market conditions, right? It could be number of organizations. It could be the size of the industry, etc. And for the perceived desirability of movement, it could depend on the equity of pay, job complexity, etc. So all of these factors could affect the two main factors in the middle, okay? So that's a basic structure of the theory that explains voluntary job turnover. Now, this is the last part of chapter 3 that we're going to talk about. Now, your textbook at the end was talking about scientific methods. Again, this is because hopefully after learning more things about concept, proposition, hypothesis, you now have relatively better understanding of this scientific method. Actually, we kind of repeated the process several times already, but here are the general steps. First of all, you want to assess relevant existing knowledge of phenomena, okay? Or basically, it means you have a problem you want to address, okay? Now, the second step and the third step are usually combined together. Second step is you formulate the concepts and propositions. Step 3, you state hypotheses. Basically, in this step, you just want to set up hypotheses kind of to test the cause of the problem, okay? And then the next step, you design research to test the hypothesis. Of course, you can, propose several causes of the problem, but which ones are the real causes? Then you need to test hypotheses to determine that. So you need to design the research. And actually, here is when you write the research prospectus. You design the research, you need to write a research plan, submit it to the management, and after obtaining a mutual agreement, you're going to go ahead and conduct the research. Next step is to acquire the data, of course. And then once you have the data, analyze and evaluate the data. Finally, based on your analysis, you will be able to determine whether hypotheses are supported or not, and that will give you the conclusion. Now, the textbook quoted several paragraphs from a book by Robert Prestes, and the title is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I have to acknowledge that I know nothing about motorcycle, let alone the maintenance. But I'm going to do my best to try to describe what's going on there. So this example actually kind of goes through the scientific method process. Now, at the very beginning, apparently, we have a motorcycle that is not working. Okay, so the problem, this researcher, or actually at this time, the researcher is the mechanics. Okay, we usually think mechanics are just doing a few fix to fix things, but actually for mechanics, it involves more than that. It involves their experience, involves their thinking, and also involves, of course, what we observed that they fix a lot of things here and there, run a few experiments to see what's going on, right? So let's just say in our example, the researcher is the mechanic, okay? And right now we have a motorcycle that's not working, okay? So the problem for this proposed research is to determine why the motorcycle doesn't work, right? Now, if the mechanic knows that the problem lies in the electrical system, then a more detailed question could be proposed and say, well, why the electrical system does not work. So it depends on whether this researcher knows a more detailed cause or is a general question. Okay. So that's I guess that's the first step, and the first step, that is, you describe the problem. Now you face the problem. So the next step is you form the hypothesis. Of course, when you form the hypothesis, you're really trying to verify what you have, whether what you have in mind is correct or not. Okay. In this case, we're trying to verify whether it is the electrical system that's causing the problem in the motorcycle. Okay. Now, suppose the researcher let's say it this way. Suppose the researcher, the mechanic, honks the horn to see if the battery works. Okay, with this example, the textbook and I want to illustrate what is failure in conducting business research, and also what is failure in this example. So suppose the mechanic honks the horn to see if the battery works. Okay, what if it worked? Or what if it didn't work? Now we would say if the horn works, we're gonna say, oh, it's not the battery, so the experiment failed because it failed to prove what we expect. However, there's a very important difference there. Okay, now when we test the hypothesis, when we conduct experiment to test our expectation, if our expectation was not supported, we will not call that a failure. It's never failure. It's just a proven that what we expected was not correct. Okay, so that's a huge difference, right? So back to testing hypothesis. If we want to find out whether it's the electrical system, now the mechanics will check a few things to determine whether that's the case or not. So he could check, for example, the spark plugs, right? Spark plugs, to see whether it's working or not. If that is working, he could try a few more things, of course, based on his knowledge. I have no idea about fixing motorcycles, so I can't suggest more, but apparently a mechanic will know a few other options to check what is going on, right? So at this time, actually, in his mind, he had several potential candidates for the causes. And all of these potential candidates actually on the hypothesis in a sense. The hypothesis that the failure is caused by, for example, spark plugs. The failure is caused by, let's see, what else could be? I don't know. I'm really sorry. I really don't know much about it. So it could be caused by something else. So for all these hypotheses, you're gonna check. He is gonna conduct experiment to check one by one to see which is the real cause. And that process, he is testing the hypothesis. Now, in business research, what we do, we also have the hypothesis listed there. We don't conduct experiment in the sense that we don't check the spark plugs, we don't, test the battery, etc. We collect data and we analyze data to determine whether the statement is supported or not. Okay, that's our way of testing hypothesis in business research. Right? Now, once the mechanic was able to determine, okay, the cause is the electrical system, then he finished that round of hypothesis testing. He finished that round of using the scientific method to solve the problem. Okay, because now he can determine, yes, it is caused by the electrical system. Now, the next step for him, of course, is to determine which part is the cause and also to determine a solution for that. For us, for business research, it's a similar idea. Once we test, okay, here are the causes for the problem, now we can think about potential solutions. And with the potential solutions, it's another round of hypothesis testing because we again need to collect data to determine whether the solutions we proposed would work or not. Okay, so that's the whole process of scientific method. And apparently, when you write your research prospectus, you will need to keep this scientific method in mind. You're gonna determine the problem you want to address. Okay, you're gonna come up with several research questions, and apparently you need to state several hypotheses for your research. Then design the research means now you need to know what data you want to collect, what variables you will need to test the hypothesis, how you collect the data, okay? And then, of course, for the research prospectus, I will not ask you to really collect data because that's not possible for one semester course. So you stop at, I would say, the methodology part. You're going to stop at how the data are collected and what data are required for the test. Then, in terms of collecting data, analyzing data, we're going to use some other exercise to practice with that. Okay. So that's all I have for this chapter number 3 about theory. Hopefully right now you have a better understanding and a better appreciation of theory we have in business. See you next time.